Peace to you. I'm glad you've joined us today. Whether you're watching via our YouTube channel or listening to our podcast, I hope that you find this a time of blessing and insight. I'm Matt Henderson, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Clarkesville, Georgia, and this is our special midweek connection, an extra opportunity to examine our theme and scripture for the week ahead. Today we begin a new series of messages titled, Wisdom is Calling, Uncommon Sense for the Church Today. And throughout this 5-week series, we'll together explore 3 collections of biblical wisdom, beginning today with the Book of Proverbs, and then following this introduction and some discussion on what wisdom is and what it has to offer Christians today. Sunday, I'll highlight several popular examples from Proverbs. And in the following weeks, we'll explore the books of Ecclesiastes and Job. But what is wisdom? And how does it differ from other biblical texts? How does biblical wisdom differ from other sources of ancient writings? I'd like for you to consider with me that our Bible is more like a library than it is a book. It's a collection of stories, histories, genealogies, poems, songs, laws, and rules, as well as a genre of writings called wisdom. And if you spend any time with the Bible, you've likely noticed some of these different styles of writings the Bible includes. Genesis, generally speaking, especially once you begin with the account of Abraham, is an historical account with the purpose of passing down the story of Israel's patriarchs. In contrast, much of Deuteronomy and Leviticus provide discussion on the law and instructions for the priests. The Psalms, they're a collection of prayers, of poems and songs which are quite different from the historical prose. But even among the Psalms, there are different styles like Psalms of praise and Psalms of lament. The wisdom writings, on the other hand, in general, provide a different perspective and objective. They're not so concerned with historical narratives or codification of the law. Rather, they are poetic expressions, artful renditions of instruction and observations of the ways of God and the ways of the world. Let me begin today by reading from Proverbs 1. And I encourage you to listen as if you were up upon your parents' knee. For Proverbs were very likely a model for families to share and teach children and youth about life, about the world, and about the God that created them. Proverbs chapter 1, beginning with verse 1. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for learning about wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for gaining instruction in wise dealing, righteousness, justice, and equity, to teach shrewdness to the simple, knowledge and prudence to the young. Let the wise also hear and gain in learning, and the discerning acquire skill. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Hear, my child, your father's instruction, and do not reject your mother's teaching, for they are a fair garland for your head and pendants for your neck. Now here, after this introduction and explanation about the purpose of wisdom in general, and the book of Proverbs specifically, the parent who's speaking now turns to the child with some practical advice about not running with the wrong crowd, and encouragement about staying out of trouble. We're at verse 10. My child, If sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, "Come with us," let us lie in wait for blood. Let us wantonly ambush the innocent. Like Sheol, let us swallow them alive, and whole, like those who go down to the pit. We shall find all kinds of costly things. We shall fill our houses with booty. Throw in your lot among us, and we will all have one purse. My child, do not walk in their way. Keep your foot from their paths, for their feet run to evil, and they hurry to shed blood. For in vain is the net baited while the bird is looking on. Yet they lie in wait to kill themselves and set an ambush for their own lives. Such is the end of all who are greedy for gain. It takes away the life of its possessors. The book of Proverbs, as it begins, presents this objective: to raise an awareness to the world around us, to point to God's activity in the world, and to instruct in ways of righteousness, justice, and equity. Proverbs points to both that which might seem common sense and natural, but also to God's uncommon sense, that God's ways are not our ways. The wisdom of Proverbs is not just about gaining insight and knowledge, things that might remain cognitive and even esoteric, but it is about the practical application of knowledge. The wise person is someone not only who understands the ways of God and the ways of the world, but is able to respond in ways that benefit themselves and those around them. The wise person is not a sage upon a lofty mountain that sits and ponders life's mysteries all day, but one who engages in the exercise of living, of thriving, of overcoming. Israel's wisdom literature does not emerge in isolation, but within a larger context of ancient writings from throughout the ancient Near East. Babylon and Egypt, for example, have similar collections of wisdom writings. Some, which would likely sound familiar to a modern Judeo-Christian reader with even a moderate experience with the Scriptures. What scholars have found is that Israel will frequently borrow from these other collections, sometimes in verbatim, often, though, modifying and adapting them to better reflect the character and nature of the one true God. In general, the many gods of the other nations around Israel did not act in the interests of the common people, rarely engaged in personal or meaningful interactions. And Yahweh, Israel's God, in contrast, was approachable, was involved in the lives of humans, especially the chosen people of Israel. And Yahweh was a source of blessing and goodness. And the central theological thread throughout Scripture and in Israel's wisdom writings is that everything that God does for a reason, a good reason, and even if it cannot always be always understood. And this stands in contrast to the gods of Egypt and Babylon and the other ancient neighbors. Those gods are described often as fickle, erratic, and unpredictable. In general, the wisdom writings of the people of the ancient Near East, and specifically our spiritual ancestors, the people of Israel, are a lot like people today. They reflect a longing to learn how to live optimally in the world they found only partially understandable. They took note of successful and unsuccessful ways of coping with life, stated them memorably, artistically even, and passed them on to others. They also observed that life is often inexplicable and the lot of human beings is to be miserable. And they often explored those with complaints and dialogues, which we'll turn our attention to in the coming weeks when we look at Ecclesiastes and Job. Our modern world today, while it might be interested in how to live optimally in our world, does seem less concerned about the role of the divine in the world around us and how to live lives of righteousness, justice, and equity, even within the church. Because it's written in a confusing manner in poetry that doesn't rhyme, in collections that are often puzzling and mysterious, it seems that biblical wisdom has become uncommon sense. People are not committed to heeding the cry of wisdom, not learning what wisdom has to say about, much less following the way of wisdom as a way of life. On last Sunday, when I began to announce this series of Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job to the congregation, the reply was fairly unanimous. That's quite an ambitious task you've undertaken. And I 100% agree. These are perhaps three of the most understudied, underpreached, misunderstood scriptures within the Old Testament, if not in the whole Bible. And I will certainly admit that I can only begin to scratch the surface of the material in the 5 short weeks we have before us before Lent. Even with this extra midweek message, we can only cover so much with this complex material. Yet my goal and prayer is that by considering this material, we can dismantle some of the obstacles a casual reader usually faces, and together discuss the material within their literary, historical, and theological contexts. Now, we won't solve all the problems or uncover all the secrets. Perhaps, though, we'll be a little more comfortable, a little less intimidated with sitting still with the complexities of wisdom. Although Proverbs is not a story, on Sunday we'll be introduced to the main characters used throughout Proverbs. We'll read the rest of the first chapter as well as some of chapter 8 and chapter 26, and I encourage you to read ahead of time to become familiar. And my next midweek message will be on the commonly referenced 31st chapter of Proverbs, known often as an ode to a godly or virtuous woman. But now, thank you for joining me in exploring the meaning of wisdom. Remember, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Well, I hope you'll join us in worship on Sunday, either in person or online, or even streamed later in the week. And that by joining us, you'll find yourself a little more comfortable with the wisdom writings of the Bible, and a little more aware of God's mysterious ways in the world, even today. Until then, the peace of Christ be with you.